So welcome everybody. Just to fill you in, I'm talking with Ben Wyler. Ben's an emergency physician with an interest in travel medicine. He's currently working in New York, which is going to be interesting for all of us. And during our 2020 conference, he subbed in at the last minute to give a presentation on COVID-19. And it was a pretty sobering presentation. I think it woke a lot of us up to what we would be facing when we got home after perhaps even some cynicism about the whole illness. And I certainly probably hadn't got myself all over this topic. So it was an incredibly useful presentation. And we just thought it'd be interesting to follow up with Ben to see how things were in New York. And Ben's also got some perspectives on what the future holds. So firstly, Ben, how are you?
Doing good. It's nice to finally sort of be getting back to some semblance of normalcy after, this initial wave of just tons of patients and really kind of a stressful period. And then followed by sort of, the calm after the storm where a lot of people were discouraged from coming in. So the ER was pretty empty. And now this week, it's sort of feeling like we're getting back to business as usual. Still small numbers of COVID patients coming in, but certainly not anything like what we were seeing, a month ago.
Yeah, right. Well, that's good news. It sounds like things weren't quite that way when you got back from Colombia. So I guess we broke up the conference in like the end of the second week of March, which feels like a year ago, but it's only 2 months ago. Just remind us where you returned to and what hospital you were working in and what it's been like in that 60 or 70 days since the conference.
Yeah, I work at two Mount Sinai hospitals that are both on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The timing of the conference was really pretty uncanny because the day that I arrived back, Mount Sinai imposed an international travel ban, work-related travel ban, followed by banning any travel outside of the region for work. So we were all sort of, confined to the city and anticipating this big wave of patients that was going to be coming. But the city didn't go on lockdown until March 22nd. And so there was still another week and a half where, if you went out, bars and restaurants were full, the subway was packed, people were sort of going about their usual life. And, looking at the numbers, it still hadn't quite sunk in the reality of the situation. The day that we went on lockdown, New York had around 10,000 confirmed cases, New York City. And 3 weeks later, we had 100,000 cases.
Wow.
So it all hit us very quickly. That 10,000, we were seeing small numbers. And then for a period of several weeks, the numbers were just getting bigger and bigger every single day. And, I think the fear level was also rising with that. We kept having to move into new clinical spaces. So, the pediatric ER was basically taken over with COVID patients. The city was opening up new locations like the Javits Center and the USS Comfort, which ended up not really being used very much. But there's there's a cathedral next to one of the hospitals where I work, and were talking about opening up basically the floor of this of the church to use as a ward. They were opening up all kinds of spaces that previously had been used for other reasons as COVID wards in the hospital. And there was a sense of not knowing when this was going to stop and whether we were going to be, spilling out, we're going to be spilling out into the streets. So there was a lot of anxiety. One of the particular things that I remember, I was particularly focused on was the issue of ventilator capacity. Because, I'd done some back of the envelope calculations, and I was almost certainly convinced that we were going to exceed our capacity. We didn't have really clear numbers on what our capacity was or projections, but just seeing the rate at which things were increasing, I was really worried that we were going to run out of vents. And worried about what that was going to entail in terms of having to have allocate vents, deny vents to patients, having to split vents, and trying to be prepared for that. Because I didn't want to, walk into work one day and find out, sorry, we have no vents, and then, have young people coming in respiratory failure and have nothing to be able to do for them.
Yeah.
So, and then, PPE was one of the other things that was a concern. We went from the time that I gave the lecture where WHO was mostly talking about this as being a droplet transmitted infection. And we really weren't taking very extreme precautions. I mean, we were wearing masks, but we were, for the most part, had patients that were suspected COVID, and we were only putting a mask on to go into the room to see them, and donning and doffing gowns in between, but we weren't wearing masks the whole time in the department. And that very quickly evolved to maximal PPE, and then concerns about our supply of PPE. So pretty quickly we got to the point that we were wearing a face mask and eye protection, or an N95 respirator and eye protection continuously throughout the shift. And then taking some additional precautions if we were intubating or going in to see a patient that we had high suspicion of being COVID. But really the whole ED at some point became sort of a hot zone where we just had to assume that everybody had COVID, and we didn't have a great system for, cohorting the suspected COVID patients separate from the non-COVID patients, because we were just limited in terms of the space that we had.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it sounds like it's been busy and exhausting. And listeners, last time I spoke to Ben about 2 weeks ago, he had a pressure sore across the top of his nose, and he was looking pretty tired, but he looks better today, so that's good. You spoke to us at the conference about the disease, and you knew a lot about it at that time. Were there things that really surprised you about dealing with it clinically to what you knew back then?
Yeah. The first thing I think was just the fact that this is a very contagious disease. I don't think I had appreciated that quite as much. The idea that this is an airborne transmitted disease, and living in a city where, we just have incredible density of population. So it's really hard to distance from people. So when you're walking out on the street, the streets are often packed and you're shoulder to shoulder with people. And I was taking the subway to work, well into up until about the first week of April, and the subways would be packed. And so, realizing that this virus can persist on surfaces for several days, and that there's airborne transmission, I think was a surprise. And it didn't really hit home until we started seeing cases rise and realizing, how easily this can spread. And that includes people, at work, staff, physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists getting sick on the job, and realizing that even with the precautions that we're taking, that, people were getting sick. The second thing is, I think until you have been through an epidemic like this, wrapping your head around what exponential growth looks and feels like is really hard to do. So, again, going from, in a matter of 3 weeks, from 10,000 patients to 100,000, it's just really hard to fathom, how quickly things get out of control with that kind of growth. And because there's about a 2-week lag from when you impose these kinds of distancing measures until you actually see the effect of that, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with, realizing that the whole city's going on lockdown, and yet the numbers just keep growing and growing and growing. And so there was a point, I think this was around the time that we went on lockdown, that I did a back of the envelope calculation. We had about 10,000 deaths globally at that point. Mm-hmm. And I calculated that in a month, if we had not implemented, these kinds of measures, or if they were ineffective, we would have over 1 million deaths. So that was just something that I think really started to hit home as the numbers started to rise. And then the third thing is that this disease is clinically very different than I think what we thought of back in March. All of the talk about it was describing it as an ARDS syndrome, which, I think we all have experience with, and, thinking of primarily the treatment being respiratory support, and PEEP and early intubation. And since then, we've learned that it's really largely, I think, a vascular disease, that, there's a lot of endothelial damage and activation of coagulation cascade and thrombotic disease and cytokine storm that has leading to end organ dysfunction. And so, we started to see sort of early on that this wasn't just acting like an ARDS. We'd see people that came in satting 70% and breathing at a normal rate, not in any distress, and started hearing these reports about, on autopsy finding microthrombi in small pulmonary vessels, and started becoming aware of that. And it changed our practice. We went from sort of early intubation for hypoxia to being more tolerant of hypoxia, proning patients more, focusing more on these thrombotic effects. But there were also some, a lot of surprising asymptomatic infections or presentations that were unexpected. So I guess on the side, I don't know if this was asymptomatic or if there's some way to connect this, but we had several cases where we would get a CAT scan for a patient with right lower quadrant pain to look for appendicitis and find that they had appendicitis and ground glass opacities at the bases of their lungs. So realizing that there were a lot more infections out there than what we were looking for was part of that. And then we would also see patients with things like encephalopathy, young patients presenting with strokes, with heart attacks, with PEs. So some of these thrombotic complications or secondary effects of just the cytokine storm was really sort of shocking in terms of, the disease. And now we're finding out in children who we thought were mostly asymptomatic that there's a Kawasaki-like syndrome that these kids are getting. So this is really a very different disease from anything that I've seen before or can recall studying in medical school. It's a really unique clinical entity.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear that. I guess we've been relatively lucky here in Australia, so we just don't have the experience with this end of the illness to any great degree, which is amazing. But to hear what your clinical experiences have been is absolutely fascinating. It must be difficult looking out from an epicenter to try then to step back and think about the whole globe. But what do you think the main challenges are for, a wider perspective outside of an epicenter, where I guess the disease prevalence is maybe a little less, but we've still got to deal with cases and.
I'm actually, unfortunately, really worried about the global perspective with this disease. Early on, when China and South Korea were two of the countries that were hit early and seemed to have done a pretty incredible job of, containing it largely through really expansive testing and contact tracing, and taking advantage of technology using things like cell phone data or public surveillance to be able to identify potential contacts. Europe had a big wave and has seen a lot of the mortality from this disease, but a lot of the countries have really brought their curve down and have much smaller numbers of cases right now. It's hard to generalize about the United States, I think, because there's so much heterogeneity in terms of how different states are approaching this. New York is looking pretty similar to Europe in terms of their ability to bring down the cases. But some of the other states are taking a less dramatic approach. And so we'll see what effect that has. But, the hotspots in the world right now are largely countries like Brazil and India and Pakistan, Bangladesh. And these are countries that, still are having growing number of cases every day. So have not been able to even get their cases to plateau. And they're countries that have much fewer resources in terms of, hospital resources or testing resources to be able to either treat sick patients or to do the epidemiological control and tracing that would be needed to try to mitigate the impact of this. And so the other thing is that these are largely urban countries that have a lot of poverty and really poor housing, and tight quarters in these urban environments, and that's really just a hotbed for transmission of infection. So I know you asked about Latin America. I know I've looked at the numbers for Brazil. I don't know really what's going on the ground there. I have been in touch with people in Peru because I've done work there in the past. And I can say, I think it varies a lot depending on the setting. I've been hearing from a colleague in Cusco in the mountains who says that they really took the lockdown seriously. All the businesses are closed. They locked down very early, and he's not seen a lot of cases. But I know that Lima, the capital, has seen a lot of cases, and Iquitos, which is a city of 500,000 people in the Amazon, which is not accessible by road, has been, from what I understand, really a catastrophe. They haven't had the hospital capacity to care for patients, and even haven't had enough oxygen in some cases to be able to treat some of the milder cases who just need supplemental oxygen, because it's really hard to get resources there. So I think depending on the resources that are available and the housing situation, those are going to be two things that really determine how bad this is. I'm very worried about South Asia because all three countries in South Asia are seeing, increasing numbers, and this is a region with 1.7 billion people. So the potential for it to, really cause catastrophic outcomes there is really, a big risk. And Africa, the numbers coming out of Africa are not that high, and I don't know how much of that is because of limited testing. African countries do tend to have younger populations, which may, limit some of the mortality there, but they also, have high levels of poverty. And poverty, I think, is one of the things that is going to have the biggest impact. This was true in New York as well. I was lucky to be working in Manhattan because all the other boroughs in New York got hit much harder than we did. And, the areas that I work, as bad as it wasn't anything compared to other parts of the city where, there are poorer households, a lot of them multi-generational, or where people live with multiple roommates, in small apartments and have to commute long distances, on public transportation. So all of those things, I think, were factors that led to much worse outcomes in those areas. And I think that that's going to end up being true on a global scale as well. And then, the other thing is just there are going to be second order effects of this. So the impact on economies, on food supplies. I worry about some of the places where locking down really, in terms of what that means for livelihood for people and for food supplies is going to, could lead to sort of a lot of second order problems.
Yeah, it's certainly an unprecedented illness and an unprecedented time for the world. It's an interesting thing to talk about, but perhaps not to think about for too long. We are going to try and talk to some of our colleagues around Latin America in the next few weeks. Interestingly, I just had some contact from some of the pre-hospital and inter-hospital guys and girls from Chile. Their critical care capacity in Santiago is now maximized. So they're looking for advice and support on moving patients to peripheral cities that are already receiving critical care. So, a very advanced system that is, at a point where they're looking at options that they wouldn't normally countenance. So, there's strains being seen even in an area that's dealt pretty well with the illness by all accounts. So yeah, we're going to try and talk to Ana Paula and perhaps Manrique from a different perspective in Costa Rica in the next few weeks, which will be interesting. You've talked a little bit about the supportive care. is there anything on the horizon in terms of focused therapies that you think are going to be useful? There's already prominent people taking certain focused therapies, whether that's a useful thing or not. But
Yeah.
what's your perspective?
You know, when I gave the presentation at DevelopingEM, I think, you know, I sort of glossed over it and said there's no proven therapy. And unfortunately, I don't think we're in too much of a different situation right now. You know, the drug that's gotten the most sort of attention has been remdesivir, and the large Gilead trial, about 3 weeks ago, they reported positive results from it, and they sort of gave the headline numbers, but there still is no published study. So it's sort of hard to scrutinize that to know, you know, what to make of it. But the numbers that they published were that it reduced the time to a significant clinical improvement from about 15 days to 11 days. And that was their primary endpoint. So they showed that, and they stopped the trial early, actually, on the basis of that. And they also reported mortality data that it reduced mortality from about 11.8% to 8%, which is, you know, pretty significant. Yeah. And this was in a fairly severe group of people. You have to be a little bit careful, you know, interpreting this when all they're reporting is the headline numbers. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic and have to assume that, you know, this wouldn't have gotten as much public attention if somebody hadn't, you know, sort of looked at the data. But I'm anxiously awaiting the publication of that study. I don't think that this is going to be a game changer. I mean, it certainly helps. Anything that we can do for the most severely ill is going to be majorly helpful, but this is an IV therapy. I don't know how much capacity we're going to have to, you know, to provide this to people around the world. Some of the other things that there is some, you know, I think growing awareness of, or there may be studies coming out soon. Anticoagulation, particularly heparin, seems to be helpful in preventing some of the end organ damage from this thrombotic process. Yeah. And there have been some small studies that that suggest that there is a benefit there, a mortality benefit. There's a lot of investigation going on now with some of these inflammatory modulators. So the IL-6 antagonists, tocilizumab, I think, is the one that has been the most studied, and giving steroids to patients sort of in these later stages. And we just don't have enough data on that yet. There's studies going on with convalescent plasma, which is actually one of the big things. Mount Sinai is doing a lot of work with convalescent plasma, okay. But no big published studies on that. I'm a little bit skeptical that anything that addresses, you know, we sort of have therapies that are antiviral therapies and therapies that are immune modulating or preventing some of the downstream complications. And so, you know, in these severe patients, I think they're already past, you know, a lot of the viral replication, and it's really the immune phenomena and the downstream effects that are causing a lot of the pathology. So I'm a little bit skeptical about, you know, the ability to have a big impact on mortality at that late stage. And I'm hopeful that we're going to find some drugs that can be given early in the course, that are, you know, small molecules, cheap, that could be even taken prophylactically. And among those, I think, you know, the three that I'm sort of the most intrigued by, hydroxychloroquine obviously is the one that everybody's been talking about and some prominent people have been taking. I will disclose, I'm actually working I'm part of a randomized control trial giving hydroxychloroquine prophylactically to healthcare workers to see if there's any benefit. So I think that that's probably the place that it will have benefit based upon what we know about how it works, but there's not been any good data showing benefit for patients that are already, you know, sick enough to be hospitalized. So hopefully we'll have in a few months, you know, some data on that. The second one is zinc, which is sort of interesting because it's been shown to help with other coronaviruses when people, you know, common cold is a coronavirus, and you know, there's really good data showing that for common cold, if you take it early in the course, it leads to more rapid resolution.
Okay.
And it's the same mechanism that would be expected to work for this. So that's something that potentially, could be available and easy for, large number of people to take with relatively few safety risks. And the third one, which is interesting because it's sort of come full circle, are ACE inhibitors. So early on, they were proposed as being beneficial. And the thought was because it's an ACE2 receptor that the virus binds to, that if you, block the receptor, it turns out that ACE inhibitors don't act on ACE2, only on ACE1. And then there was a concern that they actually upregulate ACE2 so that they could be more harmful. But there are two fairly large retrospective studies that have looked at people with hypertension on ACE inhibitors versus other antihypertensives and have found that they have lower mortality adjusting for other conditions, the people who are on ACE inhibitors. So that's another one that you could imagine that maybe it has some effects on the vasculature, and because we think this is a vascular disease, that it could be protective through that mechanism. But again, these are like limited size retrospective studies. So, but those are the ones that I'm sort of most interested in keeping an eye out for, for larger studies and more data.
Interesting stuff. I guess the $1 million question is, or the future would seem to be some sort of vaccination strategy in a virus that maybe has significant problems developing a vaccine. You hear talk of 12 to 24 months and staying partially locked down for that entire period. And do you think that we will see an effective vaccination against this crazy virus, or?
I wish that I knew. If I had to bet on it, I think that we will eventually. But the fastest that any novel vaccine has been developed was 4 years, and that was for mumps vaccine. Right. So the idea that we would be able to do this in 12 to 24 months, I'm really hopeful that we can. I know that they're working on multiple steps of the vaccine development sort of in parallel rather than in series. And they have something like 20 or 30 candidates that they're looking at, across the globe. So, and there are some features that I think are fairly promising. They pointed out the problem with influenza, the reason why we need a flu shot every year is because there's rapid mutation. And this virus does not appear to be mutating rapidly. So in particular, the spike protein, which is the target for a lot of these vaccines, seems to not be mutating very much. So I think that that's hopeful. In the absence of a vaccine, we're going to, assuming that there is a way to get robust immunity, it's sort of a race between a vaccine and naturally getting to that point by people just getting infected. And I agree with you. I think, the degree to which we can slow the spread over the course, if this is going to take a couple years, what it's going to cost us to be able to do that economically, psychologically, socially, politically, it's hard to imagine that we can maintain, the level of restriction that we've had the last few months for that kind of time frame. So if it's a year, it's probably worth it. But I think at some point, it's sort of a race between natural spread of the virus and ability to develop a vaccine. The worst case scenario is that there is not a way, that we don't find a vaccine that gives long-term immunity, or that natural immunity ends up, not being long-term. And if that's the case, we could end up with a seasonal disease where this, goes in waves through the population like influenza does. I don't think that that's likely, but, all of this is speculation. I think I think the vaccine, an effective vaccine, is the greatest hope that we have right now. And it'll be interesting to see, with the global community working on this and devoting a lot of resources to that, how quickly we are able to come up with them.
So for those of us who like attending international emergency medicine conferences, what do you reckon the next 12 months looks like? Do you think that will still be a thing?
I can't imagine that we're going to be going to, at least in the next 6 months, that we're going to be going to any international conferences. And I would say probably, I would be surprised if we are in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
At some point it comes down to risk tolerance. There's personal risk tolerance, institutional risk tolerance, collectively as a group, the degree to which we can sort of take precautions to reduce the risk. But I think that there's probably going to be enough work to do on the home front and enough concern about, risk from air travel and large gatherings that, that until we have a vaccine or until we have high levels of herd immunity, I don't really think that it's going to be likely that we're going to be taking that risk.
Yeah. I guess we're always looking to the future here at DevelopingEM, and we're having conversations with colleagues in Africa about 2022, and we need to stay positive. And I'd be very disappointed if we weren't able to have the type of face-to-face meeting that we're known for, because I think that's where most of our benefit comes from long term.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I'm looking for presenters for 2022. There's probably going to be a smaller pool to choose from. Are you happy to give a hopefully historical presentation on COVID-19 somewhere in Africa at that time?
Absolutely. I'd be honored to do that. That would be great. It's interesting. I'm actually reading a book right now that was sort of lessons learned, historical perspective looking back on SARS.
Right.
And it's interesting to see that, we didn't really follow the lessons that were learned the last time. I think this time is going to be different. I think there are going to be a lot of things that change once we get through this. And this isn't going to be the last pandemic threat that we see in our lifetimes, but hopefully the last pandemic that actually gets out of control like this one did.
Well, mate, thank you for that. It's been awesome chatting with you again, and be safe, and we'll chat again soon.
Yeah, great talking to you.